She grew up in a small neighborhood where dreams didn't go far. People there believed in routine, not in miracles. Her parents worked long hours, and their little home was filled with the sound of quiet struggle. But inside that home stood something that made her world different: an old, faded piano sitting near the window. Its keys were chipped, the wood was cracked, and half of the notes sounded off. Yet to her it was more than just an instrument. It was her escape. Every evening after school, she would sit on the worn-out stool and touch those broken keys like they were something holy. The neighbors could hear her sometimes, slow, clumsy notes drifting through the walls. They laughed softly and said she was wasting her time. "She's just pretending," they would say. "No one from here becomes a musician." But she didn't care. When her fingers moved, the world around her disappeared. It didn't matter that her piano was old or that her classmates made fun of her. The only thing that mattered was the sound, those imperfect notes that somehow spoke for her when she couldn't find words. At school, she didn't talk much. She wasn't one of the popular students. She wore the same few clothes every week, and her shoes were always a little too big. Some kids whispered about her behind her back. Others ignored her completely. During lunch breaks, while others gathered in noisy groups, she would sit alone under a tree, sketching tiny music symbols on the corner of her notebook. She wasn't lonely because in her mind, she could hear melodies no one else could. One afternoon, her teacher asked the class what they wanted to be when they grew up. The answers were predictable: doctor, engineer, pilot. When it was her turn, she said quietly, "I want to be a pianist." The room went silent for a second, and then a few laughs broke out. Even the teacher gave a polite smile and said, "That's very ambitious. But maybe you should think about something more practical." That moment stayed with her. She went home that day feeling small. She sat at the piano staring at the cracked ivory keys. For a long time, she didn't play anything. Then she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play the soft tune she always played when she was sad. The melody filled the room, slow, trembling, and honest. And somehow it gave her strength again. Her parents supported her as best they could. They didn't have much money, but they understood her love for music. Her father often came home tired, but still asked her to play something for him. "It helps me forget the day," he would say. Her mother would smile and hum along from the kitchen. They didn't understand music deeply, but they understood her. That was enough. Sometimes at night, when everyone was asleep, she would light a small lamp and continue to practice. The room would glow softly, and her shadow would move across the wall as her fingers searched for the right notes. She made mistakes, but she never stopped. There were nights she cried out of frustration when a piece didn't sound right. But even then, she wiped her tears and kept going. Music wasn't easy for her. She didn't have a teacher or fancy lessons. She learned by watching old videos on a borrowed phone and reading whatever music sheets she could find online. Many of them were incomplete or hard to read, but she didn't give up. She tried to copy what she heard, slowly teaching herself how to feel every note. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One day, her school announced a small talent show. Students were allowed to perform anything: singing, dancing, or playing instruments. Her heart raced when she heard about it. She wanted to join, but the thought of playing in front of others scared her. What if they laughed again? What if she made a mistake? That night, she sat by the piano thinking about it. Her grandmother, who lived with them, saw her sitting there in silence. The old woman smiled gently and said, "Why do you look so worried?" She hesitated before answering, "They'll laugh if I play." Her grandmother placed a soft hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Let them laugh. They laughed at me too once when I said I wanted to sew for a living. But I did, and those same people came to buy my dresses later. You don't need everyone to believe in you. Just believe in yourself." Those words stayed with her. The next morning, she wrote her name on the sign-up sheet. When the day of the talent show arrived, her hands were shaking. She wore her cleanest dress, even though it was a little old. As she waited backstage, she could hear the audience laughing and clapping for others. Her turn was next. She felt her heart pounding so hard that it almost hurt. When they called her name, she walked up slowly to the piano. The light from the stage was bright and hot. She sat down, but for a moment she couldn't move her hands. She heard a few whispers in the crowd, someone saying, "Oh, it's her." She closed her eyes and tried to remember why she was there. Not for them, not for their approval, but because this was the only thing that made her feel alive. She pressed the first key and the sound came out soft but steady. The room went quiet. The next note followed, then another, and soon a gentle melody began to fill the air. The same people who had laughed before now listened without a word. Her small hands moved gracefully, finding each note with care. It wasn't a perfect performance, but it was full of feeling. By the time she finished, there was a stillness in the room that felt like respect. And then a few claps. Hesitant at first, then stronger. She didn't win that competition. The prize went to someone else, someone who had lessons and fancy clothes. But it didn't matter. That night when she walked home, she felt lighter. She had faced her fear and played anyway. After that, she practiced even more. She saved every bit of money she could to buy new sheet music. She borrowed old books from the library about composers and read their stories. How many of them were doubted too? She began to believe that maybe all dreamers go through the same test, people not believing in them until they prove themselves. Still, life didn't suddenly become easy. There were days when her fingers hurt from practice. There were times when the electricity went out and she had to play in the dark. There were moments she thought about giving up, wondering if it was all pointless. But every time she was about to stop, she remembered how it felt to play on that stage, how for a few minutes she had made people listen. She started playing at small community gatherings. Sometimes there were only a few people, sometimes just one or two, but every performance taught her something new. She learned how to hide her nerves, how to connect with the audience, and how to let the music tell her story. Slowly, a few people began to notice her talent. One neighbor who had once laughed now stopped by just to listen. "You're getting better," he said awkwardly one evening. She smiled, not out of pride, but out of quiet gratitude. She knew she still had a long way to go. But she also knew something had changed, and not in others but in herself. The girl who once trembled at every doubt now believed in her own sound. She didn't need applause to know her worth. All she needed was her piano, her patience, and the belief that one day her music would speak louder than their words. And so every night she continued to play. The world outside kept moving, people rushing, working, doubting. But inside that small house, one girl kept chasing a sound only she could hear. It was the sound of hope, the sound of someone who refused to give up, even when no one believed she could become anything at all. And deep inside, without realizing it, she was already becoming something extraordinary, not because of fame or trophies, but because she had learned the most powerful song of all, the song of never giving up on herself. Weeks passed after the small talent show, but the feeling of being on stage stayed with her. It replayed in her mind again and again, the silence, the sound of the keys, the moment when her fear turned into something powerful. She had not won that day, but something inside her had changed forever. Now she wanted more. Every morning before school, she touched the piano keys softly, as if greeting an old friend. She practiced a few notes before running off, leaving behind echoes that her mother often listened to from the kitchen. Even after long days, she never skipped practice. The piano wasn't just a dream anymore. It had become her purpose. One day, while walking home from school, she saw a poster pinned to a wall outside a music shop. It announced a citywide music competition, open to anyone between 13 and 18. The poster said that the winners would be invited to perform in front of professional judges and music teachers. The grand prize was a scholarship to a real music academy. Her heart began to race. A real competition, real judges, real chance. But as quickly as hope came, fear followed. The thought of competing with students who had proper training, expensive instruments, and teachers made her stomach twist. She had none of that, just an old piano and her stubborn will. She stood there staring at the poster for a long time, torn between excitement and self-doubt. That night, she brought it up at dinner. Her parents looked at each other quietly. They didn't have money for travel or competition fees. Her father sighed and said, "Maybe next time, when things are better." Her mother gently added, "It's not that we don't want you to go, but we just can't afford it right now." She nodded and smiled softly, pretending to understand. But inside, her heart sank. That night she sat at her piano, unable to play a single note. The dream that had felt so close suddenly felt far away again. Later that evening, her grandmother walked into the room. She didn't say anything at first, just stood by the piano and listened to the silence. Then she spoke quietly. "You really want to go, don't you?" The girl didn't look up, but her eyes filled with tears. "I do," she whispered. "But I can't." Her grandmother smiled gently and said, "You don't need to have everything to start something. Sometimes all you need is courage." The next morning, her grandmother took out a small tin box from her cupboard. Inside were a few old coins and some folded notes, savings she had kept for emergencies. She handed them to her granddaughter and said, "It's not much, but it's enough for the entry fee. The rest we'll figure out." Her parents were surprised when they found out, but they didn't stop her. Her father said quietly, "If this means that much to you, then go. Just promise you'll give it your best." The registration was in a nearby city, 2 hours away by bus. She had never traveled that far alone before, but she did it anyway. The city was bigger, noisier, and full of people who looked more confident than she had ever felt. She saw other participants arriving with shiny instruments, dressed neatly, carrying folders of sheet music. She felt small in comparison. When she reached the registration desk, her hands were trembling. The woman behind the counter smiled and asked for her name. After signing the form, she was told the competition would take place in 3 weeks. That gave her exactly 21 days to prepare. She returned home both nervous and excited. The next 3 weeks became the hardest and most meaningful days of her life. She practiced every single day from dawn till late at night. She worked on every mistake, every weak note. When the electricity went out, she continued in candlelight. When her fingers ached, she wrapped them in cloth and kept going. Her piano, however, was getting worse. Some of the keys were sticking, and one of the pedals had stopped working completely. It made her practice difficult, but she didn't complain. She couldn't afford to get it fixed, so she learned to adapt. She used her imagination to fill in the missing sounds. One day, while practicing, one of the black keys broke completely. She stared at it, feeling a lump rise in her throat. It was a key she needed for the piece she wanted to play. A piece she had been composing herself, one that told her story without words. She sat there for a long time, trying not to cry. Then she did something simple but clever. She shifted the melody, rewriting it slightly so it could still sound complete. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Her grandmother often sat beside her during those long nights. Sometimes she would just listen. Other times she would tell stories about how every artist faces their own battles. "If it's too easy," she would say, "it's not worth it." Days went by quickly, and the night before the competition arrived, she couldn't sleep. Her stomach was tight with nerves, and her heart kept pounding fast. She imagined the stage, the lights, the people staring at her. What if she froze? What if she forgot everything? She finally closed her eyes near dawn, whispering softly to herself, "Just play from your heart. That's all." The next morning, she put on her best clothes, a plain dress she had ironed the night before. Her mother braided her hair and handed her a small charm her father had kept from his younger days, saying, "For luck." When she arrived at the venue, she was stunned. The hall was huge, filled with hundreds of people. The stage shone under bright lights, and a grand piano stood in the center like something out of a dream. She had never seen a piano that beautiful before. She watched the other contestants play, flawless performances that filled the room with confidence and precision. Some had parents who recorded videos. Others were surrounded by teachers giving last-minute advice. She sat alone in a corner, holding her music sheets tightly, trying not to let the fear show. When her turn came, her legs felt weak. Her heart was beating so loud she could barely hear the announcer say her name. As she walked onto the stage, she could feel every eye on her. She sat down, her hands hovering over the keys, and took a deep breath. The first few seconds were silent. Then she began to play. Her song started soft, a gentle melody that spoke of all her lonely nights, the laughter she had endured, the pain of being doubted, and the strength that had grown inside her because of it. Her fingers moved faster as the music grew stronger, like waves rising and crashing. The broken keys she had once struggled with had taught her something: how to make beauty even when something was missing. By the time she reached the middle of her piece, she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't thinking about the judges or the audience. She was thinking about home, about her grandmother's warm smile, her parents' tired faces, her old piano with its broken notes. Every part of her story was inside that song. When the final note faded, there was a moment of silence so heavy she could hear her own breathing. Then slowly the audience began to clap. Not loud, but genuine. Some judges leaned forward, whispering to each other. One of them nodded quietly with a faint smile. She stood up and bowed, her hands trembling. She didn't know if she had impressed anyone or if she would win anything. But as she walked off the stage, something inside her felt free. Later, while she waited for the results, she sat by herself again. She didn't care about trophies anymore. She only cared that she had done it, that she had dared to stand where she once thought she didn't belong. When the winners were announced, her name wasn't called. But to her surprise, one of the judges approached her afterward. He told her softly, "You played with real feeling. Don't stop. Technique can be taught, but emotion, that's rare." Those few words meant more to her than any prize could have. She returned home tired but glowing with quiet happiness. Her parents hugged her tightly and her grandmother cried tears of pride. That night, as she sat again at her old piano, she ran her fingers over the broken keys and smiled. The same piano that everyone had laughed at had helped her stand on a stage she once thought was unreachable. She began to play again, not for competition, not for reward, but because she loved how it felt to turn pain into sound. That night, her grandmother whispered to her before going to sleep, "You see? Sometimes all you need is one chance to remind the world what you're capable of." And the girl smiled, knowing deep down that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. She didn't win the competition that day, but she had won something more powerful. She had learned that courage once found could never be taken away. The weeks after the competition felt quiet. The noise of the city faded, the lights dimmed, and life slowly went back to its simple rhythm. But inside her heart something had changed. Even though she hadn't won, she carried a sense of peace, the kind that comes after proving to yourself that you were brave enough to try. Every time she sat at her old piano, she thought about that grand stage, the lights, the polished piano, and the sound that came from her own hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. It made her realize that she didn't need people's approval to keep going. She just needed to play. One evening, while she was practicing, her father walked in holding a flyer. It was an invitation to perform at a nearby cultural festival, open to local talents who wanted to share music or art. Her father said, "You should go. They'll love to hear you." She smiled shyly, unsure. This time it wouldn't just be a competition. It would be a public performance with hundreds of people attending, families, children, visitors from nearby towns. She hesitated at first. She remembered the laughter from her school days, the whispers when she played, the smirks when she spoke about her dreams. Those memories still lived quietly inside her, waiting to remind her how cruel people could be. But she also remembered the feeling she had on that big stage, that moment when fear faded and only the music remained. That memory was stronger, so she agreed. The weeks leading up to the festival were filled with practice. She chose to play the same piece she had performed at the city competition, but this time she wanted to make it sound even more alive. She didn't have lessons or anyone to guide her, but she listened carefully to her own heart. She changed small parts of the melody, letting it sound softer in some places and stronger in others. Her grandmother often sat near her while she practiced. Sometimes she would close her eyes and say, "This piece, it sounds like you. It tells your story." The girl would smile quietly, feeling both proud and nervous. The day of the festival arrived with bright skies and the sound of chatter filling the air. The event was held in a large outdoor space, decorated with colorful lights and banners. There were food stalls, small rides for children, and a large stage at the center where performances would take place. She arrived early with her parents and grandmother. She wore the same simple dress she had worn before, the one she had carefully washed and ironed the night before. Her old music sheets were folded neatly in her bag. She looked around and saw other performers, dancers, singers, even a band setting up their instruments. Everyone seemed confident, smiling, chatting easily with one another. She stayed close to her family, her hands cold from nerves. When the announcer began calling out names, she could feel her heart beating faster with every performance that passed. She tried to focus on the stage to see how others moved and smiled, but her mind was full of noise. Finally, her name was called. She felt her grandmother squeeze her hand gently and whisper, "Play like it's only you and the piano. Forget the crowd." She took a deep breath and walked toward the stage. The crowd was bigger than she had imagined. Hundreds of faces looked up at her. Some of them seemed kind and curious, while others looked indifferent, scrolling through their phones. The host announced her performance, and she took her seat at the piano. As soon as she sat down, a few people in the front row whispered something to each other and laughed softly. It was faint, but she heard it. Her hands trembled. She could feel that same familiar fear from long ago. the same fear from the classroom when they had laughed at her dream. For a second, she thought about walking away, but then she remembered her grandmother's words. She closed her eyes, took another deep breath, and let her fingers touch the keys. The first few notes were quiet and shaky. The laughter hadn't stopped completely. She could still hear small whispers, but she didn't stop. She focused on the melody. Slowly, the sound grew stronger, fuller, warmer. The notes began to flow like water, connecting one after another. Her nerves started to fade, replaced by something deeper, a feeling that came from her heart. The more she played, the quieter the audience became. The same people who had laughed now sat still, watching in silence. The melody filled the open air, rising and falling like a story being told without words. Every note carried a piece of her. The nights she practiced until her hands hurt, the moments she wanted to give up but didn't, the loneliness that had shaped her courage. People began to lean forward. Children stopped running and turned their heads toward the stage. A man recording the show on his phone lowered it slightly, as if realizing he was witnessing something special. Even the wind seemed to soften, carrying her music across the crowd. By the time she reached the last part of the song, her entire body moved with the rhythm. Her eyes were closed, but she could feel the energy of the audience. Silent, waiting. She struck the final note and held it, letting it fade slowly into the air until nothing was left but the quiet hum of the wind. There was silence. Not the kind that comes from disinterest, but the kind that comes from awe. Then suddenly, the crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't forced. It was real. Some people even stood up, clapping loudly. The laughter that had filled the air earlier was gone, replaced by admiration. A few in the crowd had tears in their eyes, touched by something they couldn't explain. She looked out at them, her own eyes wet, not from sadness but from relief. She bowed gently and left the stage, her legs still shaking. When she reached her family, her grandmother hugged her tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "You made them listen." Her father's eyes were shining too. "You played like someone born for that stage," he said softly. Her mother held her hand and smiled, unable to speak. That night, as the festival went on, people came up to her. Some congratulated her, others simply said, "That was beautiful." A few even asked where she had learned to play. She smiled politely and said, "At home." Later, as the sky turned dark and fireworks lit the night, she stood quietly beside the stage, watching the lights reflect on the piano. It didn't feel real. Just hours earlier, she had been the girl people doubted, the one others whispered about. Now those same people were the ones clapping for her. But deep down, she knew this moment wasn't just about the applause. It was about something bigger, about proving to herself that she was more than what people thought. She realized that sometimes the best way to answer doubt is not with words, but with action. When she got home that night, she didn't go to bed right away. She sat at her old piano again, even though she was exhausted. She ran her fingers across the broken keys and smiled. They sounded out of tune as always, but to her, they were the most beautiful sounds in the world. She began to play softly, the same song she had performed earlier. But this time she wasn't playing for anyone else. She was playing for herself, for the little girl who had once been afraid to dream. Outside, the night was quiet, except for her music drifting through the air. Somewhere nearby, neighbors who had once doubted her paused for a moment to listen. None of them laughed now. That night she fell asleep with her hands still resting on the piano keys, a small smile on her face. She had faced their laughter and she had silenced it, not with anger, not with pride, but with the sound of her truth. And though she didn't know it yet, that performance would mark the start of something much bigger. People would remember her name after that night. They would talk about the girl who played like the music came from her soul. The next morning, as sunlight entered the small house, her grandmother looked at her and said, "You see? The world always laughs before it listens." The girl smiled, nodded, and whispered softly, "Then let them laugh, I'll keep playing." And she did, and because she had finally learned that even when people doubt you, The moment you let your heart speak, the world has no choice but to listen. After the festival night, her life began to change in small but meaningful ways. The people who once passed her by now stopped to talk. Some smiled when they saw her. Others asked her to play at their gatherings or small school events. For the first time, she wasn't the quiet girl everyone ignored. She was the girl who could make a piano speak. But even with all the new attention, she stayed humble. Every evening, she still sat at her old piano, the same one with broken keys and scratches. She didn't see it as old anymore. To her, it was her companion, the witness to every tear, every laugh, and every dream she had ever had. One morning, she received a letter that made her hands shake. It was from one of the judges at the city competition, the one who had told her she played with real feeling. The letter said there would be a national youth concert in the capital. Musicians from different parts of the country were being invited to perform, and he wanted her to be one of them. She read the letter over and over again, unable to believe it was real. Her grandmother cried when she heard the news. Her parents were proud but worried too. The capital was far away. The travel cost, the stay, the clothes, everything would be expensive. They didn't have that kind of money. That night, her father said quietly, "We'll find a way. You've come too far to stop now." The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. Neighbors who had once doubted her now came forward to help. Someone donated money for the bus ticket. Someone else helped her borrow a proper dress for the event. Even the owner of the local music shop gave her new strings for the old piano so she could practice without broken notes. She practiced harder than ever. Sometimes she would close her eyes and imagine the grand stage she was going to play on, the bright lights, the audience waiting in silence. She wasn't nervous anymore. She had learned to turn fear into focus. The day of the journey came. Her family couldn't afford to go with her, so she traveled alone. It was her first time leaving home, and the road seemed endless. As the bus moved through the night, she looked out the window, watching the stars. She thought of everything it had taken to reach this point, every laugh, every tear, every broken note that had shaped her. When she arrived in the city, it was even bigger than she imagined. Tall buildings, wide roads, and people rushing everywhere. The concert hall where she was supposed to perform looked enormous from the outside, all glass and bright lights. Her heart pounded when she walked in. Inside, there were other young musicians warming up. She could hear violins, cellos, and pianos being played in different corners. Everyone looked confident, dressed in perfect clothes, surrounded by teachers and family. She stood alone, holding her worn-out sheet music, trying to steady her breathing. When it was finally her turn to rehearse, she sat down at the grand piano, its keys shining like snow under the stage lights. For a moment, she just stared at it. It was nothing like the piano back home. The sound it made was rich and full, almost like it had a voice of its own. As she played the first few notes, something stirred inside her. It was as if all the years of practice, all the quiet nights, all the moments she doubted herself, they were leading to this. The hall echoed with her music, and even the stage crew stopped to listen. One of them said softly, "She plays like she's telling a story." The next day, the concert hall was filled with people, judges, musicians, families, and guests. She could see hundreds of faces, all waiting. When her name was announced, she walked onto the stage slowly. Her heart was calm. She looked out at the crowd and thought, "This is my moment." She sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. The melody started gently, rising like the morning sun. Every note carried emotion, the pain of being doubted, the beauty of never giving up, the quiet courage that grows in the dark. The music seemed to fill every corner of the hall. The audience leaned forward, drawn into her world. Halfway through, she felt tears in her eyes, but she didn't stop. She let her emotions flow through the keys, every touch soft but powerful. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was her life in sound. Every struggle, every hope, every dream that had kept her alive. When the final note came, she held it for a moment, then let it fade into silence. The hall stayed completely quiet. For a few seconds, She thought maybe she had done something wrong. Then suddenly applause exploded around her. It was louder than anything she had ever heard. People stood up, clapping and cheering. Some even shouted, "Bravo!" The judges smiled, and one of them wiped a tear from their eye. She stood there frozen, as the applause surrounded her like a wave. She bowed slowly, her heart pounding, her eyes shining with tears she couldn't hold back anymore. In that moment, she didn't feel like the poor girl from a small town. She didn't feel like the one who had been laughed at or doubted. She felt like she had finally become what she was always meant to be. After the concert, several people came up to her. Some asked where she had learned to play. Others wanted to know if she had a teacher. When she said she had taught herself, they looked surprised. One woman said softly, "You play like someone who has lived 1,000 lives." The judge who had invited her came to her afterward and said, "I told them you had something special. You just proved it." He handed her an envelope. Inside was a certificate and a letter of recommendation for a music scholarship. She couldn't believe it. A scholarship meant real training, real lessons, and a chance to become a professional musician. When she called home that night, her mother cried. Her father's voice trembled with pride. Her grandmother said softly, "I knew your music would travel far one day." Back in her small town, people gathered around when they heard the news. The same neighbors who once doubted her now spoke with pride. Children who used to tease her now looked up to her. She didn't let any of it make her proud or arrogant. Instead, she smiled and said, "If I can do it, so can you." Weeks later, she returned home for a short break before starting her scholarship program. The town arranged a small welcome for her. The stage was simple, the piano still old, but she played anyway. She played not to prove anything, but to share what she had learned. That talent grows in the places where people least expect it, and dreams survive only when you protect them. As she played that night, she looked out at the crowd and saw her grandmother in the front row, her hands clasped together, her eyes full of tears. That sight made her heart full. When she finished, the audience clapped again, and for the first time she didn't feel shy about it. She just smiled. Later that night, when everyone had gone home, she sat by her piano again, touching its rough keys. She whispered, "We did it." It was the same piano she had once played when she was lonely, the same one that carried her through her fears. She realized then that every broken key, every difficult day, every doubt, they had all been part of her music. Without them, her song wouldn't have been the same. That night, she looked out of her window at the stars and thought about the journey ahead. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer afraid. Her music had carried her from a small room to a grand stage, from laughter to applause, from being doubted to being believed. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. As the night grew quiet, she began to play again, softly, gently, like a whisper of gratitude. The sound floated through the window, across the empty street, reaching anyone who was still awake to hear it. It was a song of belief, the kind that comes after all the doubt has faded away. After the scholarship and the national concert, life changed completely, yet nothing felt rushed. She returned to her small town, not because she had to, but because she wanted to remember where it all began. The people there had once doubted her, laughed at her, or ignored her. But she didn't carry anger toward them. She only carried music and a desire to share it. The first day she arrived back, children from the neighborhood ran to greet her. They had heard of her success from parents and neighbors. Some of them remembered the quiet girl sitting alone under the tree, sketching tiny music notes in her notebook. Others only knew the story that everyone had whispered about. The girl who had gone far, who had proved them wrong. She smiled at them, kneeling to their level, and asked, "Do you want to learn a little today?" Their eyes lit up. For the first time, she understood something deeply. The journey was not just about her. It was about the music, about the hope, about showing others that dreams could grow anywhere, even in small, forgotten places. She started visiting the local community hall. It was small, dusty, with broken chairs and a piano that was older than she was, but she didn't care. To her, it was perfect. She began to teach children one by one how to find music inside themselves. Some had never touched an instrument before. Some were too shy to even hum a note, but she didn't rush them. She encouraged them gently, showing them that mistakes weren't failures. They were part of the music. As weeks passed, more children came. Soon, the hall was filled with the sound of young voices and the clatter of tiny fingers on piano keys. Parents came to watch. They were amazed to see how someone who had once been doubted could now inspire others. One afternoon, a small boy came running to her, holding a sheet of paper. "I tried to write my own music," he exclaimed. She looked at it and smiled. The notes were messy, crooked, and uneven. But to her it was beautiful. "This is wonderful," she said. "Music doesn't have to be perfect. It has to come from your heart." Her grandmother often sat quietly at the back of the hall watching with pride. She never interfered with the lessons. She knew her granddaughter had grown not just as a musician but as a teacher, a mentor, and a source of hope. Meanwhile, invitations started coming from other towns. Schools, community centers, and cultural events wanted her to perform. She traveled occasionally, but she never left her hometown for long. She believed her roots were important, the place that shaped her courage, her patience, and her love for music. People who had doubted her at first began to change. Some apologized quietly. Others simply smiled and nodded when they saw her perform. She didn't hold grudges. Instead, she let her music speak. She realized that true power wasn't in proving others wrong, but in staying true to herself. Years passed. She grew more confident, but her heart remained humble. Her piano playing became stronger, more expressive. She composed new pieces, each one telling a story of hope, struggle, courage, and love. Each note carried a message. That dreams could survive even when others laughed. That talent could shine even in the darkest corners. And that belief in oneself was the greatest power of all. One day, a journalist came to interview her for a local magazine. They asked about her journey, how she had gone from being doubted to being celebrated. She thought carefully before answering. "I didn't set out to prove anyone wrong," she said. "I only wanted to play. I only wanted to follow my heart. The rest happened because I refused to give up." Her story spread far beyond her town. People from different cities wrote letters, some sharing their own struggles, others asking for advice. She replied to many of them personally, encouraging them to find their own music in whatever form it came. Then came a day that changed everything again. She was invited to perform at a large national music festival, one of the biggest in the country. The stage was massive, the audience vast, and the pressure overwhelming. But when she sat at the piano, she didn't feel fear. She felt calm, ready, alive. She began to play. Her music poured out like a river, flowing freely, carrying every moment of her life. The loneliness, the doubts, the long nights of practice, the triumphs, and the quiet victories. Every note seemed to speak directly to the hearts of the audience. By the middle of her performance, people were leaning forward, tears forming in their eyes. Some covered their mouths, unable to speak. Even the judges, who had seen hundreds of talented musicians before, watched in complete silence as if spellbound. When the final note faded, a hush filled the hall. Then slowly applause began. First a few, then many, until the entire audience was clapping and cheering. Some stood on their feet. Others shouted her name. She didn't know where to look first. Her heart was full, almost too full to contain. After the performance, the festival organizers approached her with offers for international training and scholarships. But she smiled and shook her head. "I'm not finished yet," she said softly. "There's still work to do here at home where my journey began." She returned to her town once again, more determined than ever. She expanded her music lessons, teaching more children, organizing small concerts for the community, and helping families who couldn't afford instruments. She became a symbol, not of fame, but of hope. She often thought back to the times when people had doubted her. She remembered the whispers, the laughter, the smirks. She didn't hate them. Instead, she felt grateful. Without those doubts, she might never have learned the strength to keep going, the courage to face her fear, or the patience to teach others. One evening, she played a special piece she had composed for her hometown. It was soft and tender, with moments of powerful crescendos that reflected her journey. People came from all around to hear her play. They sat quietly, listening, feeling, understanding. By the end, there were tears in many eyes. Some whispered, "We never believed she could do this." Others simply clapped in awe, unable to find words. She looked at her old piano afterward, the one that had carried her through every challenge. She ran her fingers over its keys, now smooth from years of practice, yet still holding the marks of the past. "Thank you," she whispered softly. Thank you for helping me become me." Time went on, and she continued to grow as a musician and as a person. She never stopped playing, never stopped teaching, and never stopped believing. The girl who had once been doubted had become a teacher, a mentor, and an inspiration to countless others. Her story spread further, reaching young dreamers across the country. Letters came from children who had been told they weren't good enough, from parents who wanted to encourage their children, and from musicians who wanted guidance. She answered each letter offering encouragement, sharing her own struggles and reminding them that talent grows best when nurtured with patience and courage. She understood now that being doubted was never a curse. It had been a test, a way to see if she could hold on to her dreams even when the world seemed against her. And she had passed. Years later, she returned once more to the small stage where it all began, the community hall, the old piano, the children who had grown under her guidance. She played a piece that combined all her journeys, a song that told of every struggle and triumph. The audience was quiet, listening, understanding, feeling. When the last note faded, there was a long, silent moment. Then applause broke out, louder and more heartfelt than ever. Children cheered. Parents cried quietly. Some whispered to each other, "We never believed she could do this." "We were wrong," she smiled softly. She didn't need to say anything. Her music had already spoken. That night, as she walked home, she thought about everything that had happened. The doubt, the laughter, the small victories, the big stages, the students she had taught. She realized something powerful. Dreams don't just belong to the dreamer. They belong to everyone who dares to believe in them. She sat at her old piano one last time that night and played softly. The notes floated through the small house, across the quiet street, and into the hearts of anyone who listened. For her, the journey was never about fame or recognition. It was about music, courage, hope, and the power of never giving up. And deep down, she knew she had done more than play beyond belief. She had inspired belief in others, the kind of belief that could change lives, one note at a time. The girl who had once been doubted had finally become the person she was always meant to be. And in every note she played afterward, she carried that truth, that courage, determination, and love for what you do can overcome any doubt, and that the music of your heart is always worth sharing.